A good morning or afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Janice Reichert, Executive Director of the Antibody Society, and I will be one of the speakers. The topic is Antibodies to Watch in 2022, which is also the subject of a paper that will be published soon. As many of you know by now, Antibodies to Watch refers to an article series that I started in the fall of 2009. That led to the first publication, Antibodies to Watch in 2010. In each year since then, I've written an article that describes the current state of the late-stage commercial clinical pipeline of antibody therapeutics, those in regulatory review, and recent approvals. For the past few years, I've definitely needed some co-authors as the pipeline has expanded rapidly. Two co-authors of Antibodies to Watch in 2022, Alicia Chenoweth and Silvia Crescioli, are joining me today, and we will give you a preview of the content. Please note this webinar is being recorded. The slides for today's webinar can be downloaded from the Materials tab in the viewer, and you may want those because some of the slides are very data rich, and we will not have time to go through absolutely everything. Please do add any and all questions to the Q&A box in the viewer, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, let's get started. To start with, we'll discuss overall trends in the approval of antibody therapeutics and those in regulatory review in the US or the EU. We'll then focus on events that occurred in 2021. Our overall objective with Antibodies to Watch is to highlight innovative work done by the biopharmaceutical industry. It's not to cover every single aspect of antibody therapeutics development. Therefore, we include only first approvals and first reviews. Many drugs do receive supplemental approvals for new indications, but none of that activity is included. I should also mention that we're excluding biosimilar products and we're discussing antibodies, so FC fusion proteins are actually excluded. In the past, global first approvals have almost always occurred in the US or the EU, but that's changing. So we'll also discuss antibody therapeutics that were granted a global first approval in the rest of the world. And we'll also discuss ones in regulatory review. They're somewhere other than the US or the EU. We'll then move on to discuss overall trends in the late stage development of antibody therapeutics. So just to be clear, late stage to us means a pivotal phase 2, a phase 2/3, or a phase 3 study. So we'll discuss those. Then the penultimate topic will be the antibodies to watch. So which of those in late stage development may transition to regulatory review, potentially a few by the end of the year, but most of them would be in 2022. Finally, of course, the pandemic is still with us, so we'll update you on progress in the development of antibodies for COVID-19, in particular discussing those that have gotten emergency use authorizations, and also specifically the anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in late stage development. So now let us move on to that first topic, which is overall trends in approvals and antibodies in review in the US or the EU. We have many graphs. This is the first. This provides an overview of the total number of antibody therapeutics that were approved in the two regions, US or EU, going back to 1986. You'll notice right away that during 1986 to 2013, the number of approvals were pretty low. Typically, they were 0 to 3 for most of those years. 2009 was extraordinary in that 6 were approved that year. But if you look on the right-hand side of the graph, it's obvious things changed in 2014. Starting in that year, 6 or more approvals were granted each year, and that's a consequence of this increase in the number of therapeutics, antibody therapeutics, that are in late-stage studies, which we will be discussing. The record high for approvals was achieved in 2018, and that was 13 approvals. So despite the pandemic, EMA and FDA seem to have kept the review process going pretty well. So far in 2021, 11 products have been approved, and we'll discuss those. I don't believe there'll be more approvals, but we will have to see. Sometimes FDA surprises us near the end of the year. In the next graph, this one shows that same data, but it's the cumulative totals for those first approvals. Since the early 2000s, the total approvals have lagged a little bit in the EU. In the US, the total did exceed 100 in 2021, and that was considered a milestone worthy of an article in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery. So I do direct you to that article for additional information about those approvals in the US. Given the number currently in review with EMA, the approvals in the EU may reach that 100 mark in 2022. So we do look forward to seeing that next year. In this graph, we're showing the total novel antibodies. So again, this is a first regulatory review for these particular antibodies. These are the ones that I counted in the Antibodies to Watch article. So you can go back to Antibodies to Watch in 2014 and see the specifics of which antibodies I'm talking about there. As you can see, the number increased to 10 in 2017, but because of that record number of approvals that occurred in 2018, you see the number drop off, pretty dramatically drop off in 2019. But since then, we've seen quite the rebound. The number increased substantially, and it now stands at 19, which will be included in the Antibodies to Watch in 2022 paper. In this pie chart, what we've done is we presented the percentage of antibody therapeutics for the different therapeutic areas when we combined the approved products and those in regulatory review. We did that because it's quite rare for antibody therapeutics to fail once they reach regulatory review. So it's likely that most, if not all, of those antibody therapeutics in review will ultimately be approved. And Antibodies to Watch is always intended to be a prospective article series. So we're looking forward to what will happen in the future. So you can see here that nearly 3/4 of the antibodies are for cancer or some type of immune-mediated disorders. And that's been true for a long time. Those are traditional categories, therapeutic areas for antibody development. Infectious diseases in the cardiovascular hemostasis area are 8% and 7% respectively. So that's a total of 15% for those two. And all of the other therapeutic areas are 5% or less. In the next graph, Silvia will take over.
Yeah. Hello. In this bar chart, we have combined the data for the approved antibodies and the ones for the antibodies that are in regulatory review in either EU or US for cancer indications. And then we have divided them by target and year of approval. Not surprisingly, the most popular targets are PD-1, CD20, HER2, as well as CD19, EGFR, and PD-L1. So we have both checkpoint inhibitors and also the classical cancer-associated antigen, tumor-associated antigens. To note, we have also antibodies against a single target, only one target, but also we can see antibodies that bispecific antibodies. To note the low number, the relatively low number compared to the ones that are in late phase clinical trial that we will see later. And as you can see here, the targets for the specific antibodies are mainly targets for immune cell engagement, so combine a tumor antigen combined with CD3, but also we have EGFR and c-Met, which are actually two targets that are both expressed on tumor cells. And then the next slide is going to be taken over by Jan again.
Thanks, Silvia. So similarly, in this slide, what we're showing are the targets for that combined group again. So this is the approved antibodies and those in review in either the EU or the US, but we're looking at ones for non-cancer indications. So here, of course, the diseases are quite diverse compared to those for cancer. So the targets, not surprisingly, are also more diverse. You see there as popular targets, TNF, not surprising, interleukin-23 P19 subunit, and calcitonin gene-related peptide. But there's still quite a few antigens that are the target of only 2 antibodies and nearly 40 that are the target of only 1 antibody. So up to this point, we've been talking about trends only. In the next few slides, we'll start giving you some specifics regarding the 11 antibody therapeutics that were granted first approvals in either the US or the EU in 2021, again, so far. And here, Alicia will take over.
Thank you. So of the 11 antibodies that have been approved in 2021 so far, only 4 of these are for cancer indications. All 4 of these have been approved in the US, but only dostarlimab has been approved in the EU so far. In terms of formats, the approved antibodies here include 2 antibody-drug conjugates and 1 bispecific antibody. Interesting, this bispecific antibody, amivantamab, in addition to it being bispecific, also has been produced with low fucose, which enhances its Fc effector function. So its mechanisms of actions are both Fc independent, such as down-modulating the oncogenic signaling through EGFR and c-Met, but both Fc dependent by ADCC and phagocytosis and trogocytosis. And notably, it's the first bispecific approved in the US or the EU that has Fc enhancing mutations. Thanks, back to Jan.
Thanks, Alicia. Okay, just as a quick reminder, the PDF of the presentation is available for downloading from the viewer, so don't be concerned about catching every detail on all the slides. In particular, I have to warn you, some of these data slides, especially the tables, there's an awful lot of information in them. We will not be able to go over everything. I will go over the high points here for the 7 approved antibodies that are for non-cancer indications. 5 of them are approved in the EU, only 3 approved in the US so far. The EU did surge ahead just recently with the approval of 2 anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibody products on November 12th. The BLAs, or biologics license applications, have been submitted to FDA for 2 antibodies, tralokinumab and bimekizumab, but those are not likely to be approved in 2021 for the reasons shown here. And I will pick up on that topic in the next couple of slides, where some of the reviews seem to be delayed a little bit, and partially because of the pandemic. Certainly that was true for bimekizumab, but also more than usual are now having to undergo second cycle reviews. Also want to point out Biogen's anti-amyloid beta for Alzheimer's disease. The approval in the US was somewhat controversial. The advisory committee was not impressed with the efficacy of the antibody, but FDA approved it. So we do eagerly await what EMA has to say about that particular antibody. Now, moving forward, we will talk about the antibody therapeutics that are undergoing regulatory review. So again, I want to emphasize we're excluding the EU or US approved products. Now, this is just novel antibodies that are in regulatory review. So I'll start with the 6 antibody therapeutics that are now in review in the European Union. In this case, several of them, in fact, are not also undergoing review in the US. That includes omburtamab and spesolimab. Of note of this group is faricimab, which is a cross-mab bispecific antibody from Roche. It may be approved soon. It may be approved, if it's approved at the end of the year, it might be just a tad early, but we certainly expect and hope for an approval in early 2022. Now, again here, don't be scared. There's an awful lot of data here, but it's all available to you. This table shows the other 13 antibodies, all of which are in US review, and none, to the best of my knowledge, are in review in the European Union. Very nicely, EMA does make public a list of drugs that are undergoing review, but they only make that available once a month, which is reasonable. But the next disclosure will not be for another week or so. So I certainly have captured the information as of November 2021. But if the December list adds additional information, we'll have to add that as a note in the paper. And again, to emphasize the point, we're not including things that are already approved on this list, only things that have not as yet gained an approval but are in regulatory review. So again, due to the limited time, I'm just going to focus on some high points here. Those are shown in bold. In particular, I want to point out that 4 of these are sponsored by Chinese firms. All of them are anti-PD-1 antibodies. The Chinese companies are now very aggressively pursuing antibody discovery and development, and now this shows that those companies are successfully getting them into regulatory review in the US. 2 antibodies on the list target amyloid beta, and they're being reviewed as possible treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So Biogen's drug may soon have some competition. And again, picking up on that trend that I referred to, it is a somewhat concerning trend to see an increasing number of BLAs that are undergoing second cycle reviews. This previously was very rare, but again, we've never had so many in review all at once. There's no single cause. It seems like each one of these has a different issue. So partially, of course, we may just be seeing some effects of stress on both the companies as well as FDA due to the pandemic. So at this point, we've only been discussing things that are in review or approved in the US and EU. So now we want to talk about things that are happening in the rest of the world. What's gotten a global first approval or is in regulatory review outside the US or the EU. As with this table shows the first global approvals for antibodies in 2021 that were not first approved in the US or the EU. There's a total of 8, whereas in most years, to have more than 1 or 2 would be very unusual. But of course, 2021 is unusual due to the pandemic, and I note that 3 of these approvals are for anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. 2 were approved in Australia and 1 was approved in Korea. The antibody that's highlighted, or the row that's highlighted in red, I put that in red to remind me to mention that, of course, events are happening now after we've already submitted the paper. Indeed, this approval in China was announced on November 29th, or at least it was announced in English on November 29th. And we submitted the paper that day. So therefore, of course, we did not include that approval. We will have a note added in proof that will update the paper with anything that happens between submission and the time that we have a chance to add a note in proof. So we do make every effort to keep you updated with what's going on, but there's only so much we can do. There's a tremendous amount of activity, which again is due to the efforts of all of you. Now, looking at the ones that are in regulatory review. So again, as with the number of as with the approvals, the number of applications in review in Asia in particular is rising. We're currently tracking 9 molecules with the obvious commonality of PD-1 or PD-L1 being the target. Several of these antibodies are bispecific, and it includes a bispecific nanobody that is in review in Japan. Moving on to our next topic, we'll discuss trends in the late-stage development of these antibody therapeutics. And to remind you, late stage means pivotal, phase 2, phase 2/3, or a phase 3 study. All of those count as late stage. So this pie chart depicts the percentage of antibody therapeutics in late stage commercial, again, I want to emphasize this is commercial clinical development. So those late stage clinical studies and for the different therapeutic areas, same as we showed previously for the approved and antibodies in review. And you'll notice those percentages are very similar. Cancer is somewhat larger and immune-mediated disorder is somewhat smaller, but in total they comprise 3/4 of the total, same as they did for the other pie chart we showed. In this case, the cardiovascular hemostasis and infectious disease areas combined are still exactly that same 15%, but the infectious disease areas is slightly smaller. And that's because we're not including the anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies here. And the reasons we've excluded them or the reasons we've segregated data for them is because of how fast they're moving through the process and the fact that their development is really pretty irregular. Some of the antibodies are being, they enter phase 1 and all of a sudden, seems like a month later they're in phase 3. So we can't really capture something that happens that fast, so we just decided to keep that data separate. For our next slide, Silvia will take over.
Thank you, Jan. Here we show the frequency of the antibodies that are in the late stage clinical pipeline for cancer indications. As you can see here, basically all the antibodies, the targets for antibodies which have more than one antibodies against this target, except 2, are for checkpoint molecules. And here we see also other checkpoint molecules than PD-1, CTLA-4, and PD-L1 as TIGIT and TIM3 as well. Then we have a number of targets against which we only have one antibody. And then to be noted, in comparison with the slide for cancer indication of antibodies that have been approved and are in regulatory review, we can say that now, like almost a third of the antibodies are bispecific antibodies. And to be noted that there are the classical like T-cell engagers, bispecific antibodies with one arm that binds CD3 and the other arm that binds the target cell, or one arm that binds MK cells and the other arm that binds the target cells. But also, we can see these specific antibodies against checkpoint inhibitors, against checkpoint molecules, like the PD-1 LAG3 and the PD-L1 CTLA-4 bispecific. And then the next slide is going to take over by Jan again.
In a similar fashion, this bar chart depicts the frequency analysis of the antibodies in late-stage studies, but this is for the non-cancer indication. So again, to emphasize this, non-cancer covers an awful lot of territory. There's a lot of different kinds of diseases involved here, so it's not surprising to see this incredible diversity in the targets. FcRn and PCSK9 are popular targets, but more than 30 antigens are the target of a single antibody that's in late-stage clinical studies. Fewer bispecifics are included here. Again, as Silvia mentioned, many of the bispecifics that are in clinical studies are T-cell engagers, so they were covered in the cancer area. Now I just want to give you some concept of what the rest of the pipeline looks like. So again, to emphasize, this is a commercial pipeline, not included anything that's only in development by an academic center or NIH, for example. And the reason for that exclusion is because those types of organizations do not market drugs. If they develop an antibody that has commercial potential, it would be licensed to a company, and that company would move forward with it. And at that point, that's when we would sweep it into the pipeline and include it in these graphs and tables. So this graph certainly illustrates exactly how robust this pipeline is. There's nearly 500 novel antibodies, so each one is independent from the other in here. None of them are exactly the same in their sequence. Nearly 500 are at phase 1, and more than 300, so that is an additional 300, have gotten to phase 2 and have not advanced any further. The 115 in late-stage studies is the subject of Antibodies to Watch in 2022. The paper, for the very first time, will include supplemental tables that have molecular and development details, including the format, FC mutations, sponsoring companies, indications, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot more information than we could have included in the past when we included those tables in the main body of the text. 115 is just too many to try to fit in tables in the paper. The production team would not have been happy with us. So they are now very useful supplemental tables in Excel format. So you can download those and play with them to your heart's content when they are available. So now we are going to talk about the traditional antibodies to watch, which refers to the specific molecules that we think may transition from late-stage studies to regulatory review in the US or the EU in 2022, mostly 2022. There may be one or two that could sneak in there in 2021, but this is mostly 2022, and that is based on public disclosures from the companies sponsoring the clinical studies. I promise we do not get out a crystal ball and consult our crystal ball as to which ones will be going into regulatory review. This is based on the facts as we know them. There's a total of 22 so far. 6 are for non-cancer indications and 16 are for various types of cancer. And at this point, Alicia will take over.
Thanks, Jen. So as Jen said, there's 6 antibodies expected to enter regulatory review for non-cancer indications. All of these are human IgG1 based. Ventracimab is a Fab fragment of an IgG1. And of note, crovalimab, which is against complement C5, was developed by Chugai Pharmaceuticals using their sequential monoclonal antibody recycling technology, or SMART technology, which allows a single antibody molecule to bind antigen multiple times, enhancing the sweeping and removal of the C5a from the serum. And it also has additional mutations to extend the half-life and have reduced FC effector functions. Nirsevimab as well, which is against RSV, also has mutations to extend its half-life, which is a common strategy we're now starting to see being used for infectious disease therapy. So of the cancer indications, there's 16 antibodies that we expect or are thinking that will enter regulatory submission in 2022. This had to be split into 2 slides, so remember you can download these slides if you want to have a closer look as I switch through them. Of the cancer indications, we have formats that include bispecifics, we have antibody-drug conjugates, and we also have one radioimmunoconjugate against CD45. They are 4 antibodies which are expected to enter regulatory reviews after pivotal phase 2 trials rather than phase 3. And there's 8 bispecific antibodies out of the 16 of these, which is really interesting as well. Of these 8 bispecifics, 6 of them are a form of T-cell redirecting bispecifics, which bind CD3 on T cells. And also they have a separate antigen, which binds to tumor cells, which aids T-cell mediated killing of these tumor cells. And these antibodies also have been engineered to be Fc silenced, as no Fc function is required for this and may lead to detrimental non-specific immune responses. So that's why this has occurred. So our final topic for today will be the antibody therapeutics for COVID-19. And our table here shows the antibodies that have been approved or received an emergency use authorization as far as we know. So that's the best of our knowledge, as they're coming in fast and it's a lot that's happening. So as I said, the development for these is progressing really rapidly and it's quite difficult to keep up. So we're doing as well as we can in such a quick and fast time. So we've included 6 anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, as well as tocilizumab, which is the anti-IL-6 receptor, which of course doesn't target the virus, but is used to combat the symptoms in hospitalized patients. So I'll highlight a couple of things here. So it's very useful to get the emergency use authorization first and then an approval so it can remain on the market after the pandemic's done. And also, interestingly, how they've done these strategies used for the Fc engineering side of things. So the first sort of strategy they've used is extension of the half-life of these antibodies. So that's the case for sotrovimab, amaburimab, and romlusevimab. Sorry, but they're difficult to say, but those ones. And also to remove the Fc effector functions is another strategy to reduce the risk of antibody-dependent enhancement. As obviously, as COVID-19 was very quick and the antibodies were coming in fast, they weren't sure whether antibody-dependent enhancement occurred with antibodies. So just to be safe, they reduced the effector functions. So this has happened for estrivimab. And in the case of the tixagevimab and the silgavimab ones, both of these strategies have been used. So they've both been Fc silenced and have an extended half-life. So with that, I'll hand back to Jen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. One thing I will note is just this morning, I saw that yesterday, tocilizumab had been granted a provisional authorization in Australia. So yet another update that we will have to add in our note in proof. But again, to also emphasize that that things are happening fast and furious. So it is hard to keep up with everything. This is the last table, I promise. We've made it to the end. This shows 6 anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in late-stage clinical development. Here, I just want to emphasize the number. We do have plenty of more anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies that could still receive an emergency use authorization or an approval in 2022. But also I want to emphasize that a few of these are coming through with the formulation, the first formulation being intramuscular, which is obviously more convenient for patients. In the first round of antibody development that occurred in 2021, it's not surprising that IV administration was the initial formulation. Some of those were later formulated for other routes of administration, but now we see this next wave of antibody therapeutics for COVID-19 coming through with an intramuscular type of administration. So that's good. And whatever we can do to make it easier for patients will hopefully mean that more patients can get the drug. We'll now wrap up with a few key messages associated with all of this content. There was an awful lot, but a few key points are that projections for 2021 indicate we're not going to meet or exceed the record level of 13 of approvals of antibody therapeutics in the EU or the US, partially due to demands placed on the regulatory agencies by COVID-19. It'll be pretty close though. I mean, even 11, that's not bad. It's not bad at all. But there are so many in review right now, one would hope that we would get our record in 2022. That entry into regulatory review, specifically in the US or the EU, has actually increased a bit, which is surprising during the pandemic. But again, those approvals have not, which has led to a record number currently in review. The pandemic taught us a number of lessons regarding how fast one can discover an antibody therapeutic, develop it, and get it through the regulatory review process. But of course, there were strong motivations with the antibodies for COVID-19. Nevertheless, one hopes that those lessons learned will be applied in the future. I have to say that more like a year and a half ago, I was projecting that there would be more antibodies that were given emergency use authorizations, a little bit lower than I myself expected, but there are more coming through, and so hopefully we'll see more gaining those emergency use authorizations or full approvals in the near future. Finally, I do want to encourage you to watch for Antibodies to Watch in 2022. As I mentioned, it is in production. We do hope that it will land on the website, the MABS website, in hopefully late December, but certainly early January 2022. That will give you access to this massive paper as well as those very useful supplemental tables. And with that, I do want to acknowledge our fourth co-author, Helen Kaplan, who has been a co-author on an Antibodies to Watch paper since 2018. She has persevered now for a number of years, and her assistance has certainly been very much appreciated, and we plan on having her on board in Antibodies to Watch in 2023. I also want to thank the corporate sponsors of the Antibody Society for their financial support, which is definitely needed for projects like this. It really was a massive undertaking. I have the logos shown here and on the next upcoming slides in alphabetical order. So I want to point out that if you see your company's logo and you're not yet an Antibody Society member, then you can go to our website and register as a corporate sponsor member for free. So your company has already paid for your membership. Please do take advantage of it because it's free to you. And you can save your company $1 or $2 on things like meeting registrations because we have discount codes for those. And with that, I will show the last slide, which is a thank you for attending this webinar. And hopefully we've got a few questions, but if you have additional questions that you think of later, please do go ahead and send an email to me and I will get back to you. But we do have a few questions. Silvia, could you read out some of the questions?
Yes, so great presentation, a lot of analysis, thank you. Do you have any idea what is happening with leronlimab, CCR5 targeting antibody from cytidine?
Oh dear. Oh dear. Yes and no. One can only know what the company is willing to say, of course. An emergency use authorization was requested some time ago. I believe the FDA was not impressed with the data that was submitted, and therefore the EUA was not granted. I do know they are persevering with additional clinical studies, not only in COVID-19, but in an array of different diseases. So it is still under investigation. The company has, as I said, many things going on, but there has not been an advance that I'm aware of. Nothing big has happened with leronlimab.
So I can go to the following question. So do you have any comments on the new generic naming system for antibodies recently announced by WHO AMA?
Oh, gosh, I don't know that I do. Alicia or Silvia?
So,
Yeah.
as far as I'm aware, it's the one where they've decided to remove some of the naming conventions, right?
Yeah, but that was from 2017, is it? Was there a new one?
Yes, some time ago they got rid of the naming that depended on the technology used, and that's because the things have gotten incredibly sophisticated. You can't be so simplistic as saying something is chimeric or humanized or human, because there's so many other things going on with the engineering of the molecules. So they did away with that. It used to be very convenient, but it really wasn't accurate anymore. And then for a brief period of time, a brief period of time that everyone would like to forget.
So Gregory just updated and said they recently got rid of MAB as the stem and introduced a host of new endings. I think there's 800 antibodies we've got in clinical trials at the moment. I think they might have done it just as ease of naming, so they better distinguish between them, because there's only so many combinations of letters you can get at some point before it all sounds very, very similar.
Yes.
Obviously, MAB was the easiest way to identify the antibodies, but at some point you're only getting 1 or 2 letters difference between the antibodies, and that gets very, very tricky for everyone involved. So
that's true. I know WHO was a little bit concerned that they would run out of names, like literally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yet another thing that we'll have to get used to. Things change. You just have to go with the flow.
So there's another question here. It says, thanks for the great presentation. A lot of information to keep up with. It's interesting that more and more bispecifics are being developed recently. Can you summarize the process of development of these antibodies? So the development of the antibodies, as in how they make the bispecifics, are kind of not individual to each company, but a lot of companies have their own ways of making them, whether it's a lot of different mutations, the noggin hole type ways, but there's numerous ways that the bispecifics can be done, and each company kind of does it their own sort of way. So it depends on the company and how they make the bispecifics, on exactly how they've modified the antibody to be bispecific.
Yeah, there's any number of reviews that go through it's well over 100 now. And Roland Conterman, I think every couple of years, puts out a new review covering all of the technologies. And many of them are proprietary, and partially, of course, this has to do with having patent coverage on the particular bispecifics that they're making. So there's many different types of technologies, but of course, the barrier to everybody is safety and efficacy. If you've got issues with safety and efficacy, it doesn't matter what technology you used, you're going to have problems.
Yeah. So here's another question. Where can I learn more about the CMC of the products that have been approved so far or are in development?
There's a ton of information on EMA's website and on FDA. So if you go to drugs at FDA and just enter the name of the drug, you can go into various levels within the FDA website, and you'll find a tremendous amount of information about the review of it, there's just a lot there. It may not be absolutely everything, because there are some proprietary information that they black out. But if it's there and available for the public to see, you'll find it on drugs at FDA. And EMA has something similar. Their EPARs, their public access information is quite useful.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Do you have any comments regarding future prospects of antibody mimetics, such as DARPin, PROTAC, etc.?
Well, I think they need to just prove their worth in a particular indication. They're perfectly valid, viable molecules, and they have purposes. And as with antibodies or alternate formats of antibodies, nanobodies, for example, they need to find their use. All of these things are, to me, like tools in a toolbox. And you have to pick the right tool for the right job. And it's up to the companies that are developing these types of proprietary formats to find the right disease for their molecules, which they're doing, absolutely.
Exactly. So there's another question. Because bispecifics are against two targets, have you seen a trend that they take longer for review than monospecifics?
Gosh, that's a good question. There's relatively few that have gotten approvals yet, and I have to say I haven't really looked at that, so I can't tell you the facts. Because it is a fact. You can calculate that interval. You know when the BLA was submitted or an MAA was submitted to EMA, you know when it was approved, and you can sort out exactly how long that took. FDA, especially in their reports to Congress, are very specific about the time frames, the timelines that it took for certain things. My impression is that they have not taken any longer than the canonical antibodies. So I would say my impression is no, there is no significant difference there.
We'll have a good opportunity to see over the next year, hopefully.
Right.
There's so many specifics going through. So I think there's only six or seven currently approved bispecifics.
Yeah, only for cancer 4, and then I think for the non-cancer other like something like 2.
So it's a small pool currently, but we've got a lot coming through, so we can definitely keep an eye on it. But we'll see.
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions.
Well, right. Well, if we have answered all of your questions, then my last bit here is to thank you very much for your attention and for being with us today. This was recorded, so we will make an on-demand version available. Generally, that's very quick. It should be available tomorrow. It will use the same URL, so you can find the on-demand version very easily, but nevertheless, I will send a follow-up email when it is online and let you know that it's available for you to view. So please do view this or any of our other on-demand webinars when it's convenient for you. And with that, I thank you again for your kind attention and have a great rest of your day.